Good afternoon. Welcome to the watch party for the ReaBua Critical Dialogues. This is the third day of these watch parties. If you have not been aware, since Wednesday, Tekano has been hosting a series of films that were commissioned to basically celebrate the lives of ordinary women and to basically make sure that women's narratives are not erased. This started as an initiative which is known as the ReaBua in an event that was hosted in Cape Town to celebrate Mamuwini's life and recognize her as revolutionary. So today we're also going to be watching just one film. But before we jump straight into the film, I'd like to allow my two wonderful panelists to introduce themselves. I'll shoot over straight to you, Star.
Thank you, Anele, and greetings to everyone who's watching. My name is Tayeni. I'm based in Cape Town. I'm with the University of Western Cape doing a PhD there. Otherwise, I'm an activist working on land and agrarian reform in South Africa. And I'm very happy to be here this afternoon. Thank you.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Lance, and I'm also based in Cape Town. I'm at the University of Cape Town doing a PhD in public health. My advocacy stretches across different areas, and particularly the decriminalization of sex work and health systems responsiveness to queer, trans, and gender diverse people in South Africa. I am a Tekano fellow, a lifelong fellow, and really looking forward to the conversation and excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lance. I'm so excited to be having this conversation with the two of you. So the film that we are actually going to watch is called The Undocumented Women on Mines. And I think we'll then jump straight into a discussion afterwards. Thanks.
amalahle sawatshontsha kulima yini ngale njenganamhlanje kuyisande yabelunga ngithabekho kunalabantu abasebenzayo siyabaqela bathi nize ngesikhathi so abelungu boye babangekho nize nizingolovani nithi nizifihle ingolovani bangaziboni basikepela amalahle besingafuni ayagujwa ngapha kulima yini akudala ngale mara kusekudeni besingabe asiphathi lamalahle leyadafule besikiyizolo iyavutha nithi qeda amasenke yiwo la iqedile amasenke lawo nangifika la eMNS ngabasayona istofu nganaso lesi iyavutha ibuvuzela ngamanzi ubumbe futhi so kamnandi kabi neda amasenke namabhodo hayi kuyaphela shem lento le bathi yiyo le bageza ngayo lamalahle lidaka leli thina siyaligubha siyabasa.
Ucasha nje hayi kunzima nje kusele udize kodwa ngazi wenze kanjani ukuthi uzokhona ukuthola umsebenzi emayini awungeneki isimali so
La emayini the most vela ngifuna uqamba kusebenza amaZulu nabantu abahlala abanye emalokishini siyanqoba. Hayi ukuthi ababafuni inkinga enkulu la banenkinga iyi-1 abantu balaba understand umlungu la uthi nayo imshini qela namaphephe nawo umshini thola ukuthi MNS yonke ngekho namaphephe abelungu sabathatha ngaphandle ke bayakwata ke sokwenza itoyitoyi.
ID kuqala ukuthi umama bekanganayo and then umama makayitholi ID na kwabanzima kuye ukuthi ayingenzisi ngokukhula komuntu omdala bona ngizama ukuthi mama yamtshela yabona umuntu omdala vele yabo mara naye uzamile yabo balo basijikajikisa bathi bafuna le ncwadi ngibuye nayo balo bangijikajikisa yabo zange ke waze wangishiya mara ID ngifuna kakhulu ukuthi abantwana bami esikoleni bayefuna izitifiketi abantwana nami ngizokhona ukubaholela ngikhona ukuphila ngikhona ukuhlala nabo.
Seza ngokusiza ugogo la MNS because ugogo washela i-caravan. That's where we start our work and we saw a gap ukuthi this community needs our help. So that's where we lobby and for this community ukuthi this community should babe nama rights wabo because we feel like this community doesn't have rights and ama mining companies abathatha for granted because baglinda wabakiyo. So Tina, we are helping them with legal issues for them to stand for their rights. And also we are helping most of the communities with groceries and dignity pets. Yes. And sometimes when they need our assistant, mhlambe there's someone who's sick, then they contact us and we make means to come and collect them and take them to the hospital, wherever where they should go. The relationship yam nothuli, it's a very good relationship because uthuli ngammeet 2016 when I'm starting to do this job through her late mother. Yeah, bingazi ugogo, then that's how I meet Thuli and ugogo relate story sakhe ukuthi kwenzakalani empilweni yakhe unomntwana bathuthulu unabazukulu. So I've got a good relationship with Thuli. I'm helping Thuli with whatever I have. I feel like we didn't do enough because as you can see, people are still living. Since I started working here, people are still living in the same houses. There's nothing changed. We have tried to engage with the municipality to intervene so that people can be moved to the other side in Clarinet so that they locate them, the RDPs. But unfortunately, it's not happening. We even involved the mayor in one stage. She was saying that she will come and have a look, and they will also tell you that these people, they don't have proper documents, so that is why they can't get the houses.
Umama umbangisiza ngoba uthi makathola ID wenze grant bese siphila ngemali grant and nami ngikhona ukuthi ngiya kodasi ngiyahereza ngithole lokho ngitholayo siphile endlini njengamanje ngiyofuna ngolosine ngimherezweni.
inhliziyo yami ibuhlungu ngikhuluma ngomama.
Noma vele ngihlezi nje angikho right nje. Ngicabanga nje inhliziyo yami iba buhlungu nje umuntu ebengihlala naye nginaye vele sonke isikhathi.
Ngoba phela yazi bekasangizwisa ubuhlungu ngapha kana-ID ngapha unabantwana ngathi yazithule abaye phandrish asimuphi usonto labantwana need until ulungise indaba ye-ID after ID sokubuya abantwana.
Isusonto lohlala nabo labantwana uyozama ukukhuluma esikolweni ukuthi usazama ukuthi kutholakale i-ID yami ngizokhona ukwenzela abantwana isitifiketi. Cha ngiboni nje ukuthi impilo yami ngifuna ibe se-MNS nangathuthuka nje ngibe nendawo kahle ngihlale kahle nabantwana bami ngoba i-MNS ayikho right nje. Ayikho right izibhobozo matraki dust abantwana ngeke babe right.
Njengalana abantu abaningi babulawa isifuba ukukhohlela ngedust i-TB abanye badla ama-ARV siyahlupheka ngamanzi hayi kancane ne-dust nalamaroli ukuthi la phansi lana kunamuntu osizayo. Ikhansela yilo leli belikhosa ukuthi likhethwe manje kuyaliwa.
Yazi siyacomplaina mara angiboni umehluko mina. Angiboni umehluko ngoba nalaba bathi makomiti ini nje akukho into abayenzayo sibonayo.
Inzima reg. Mara wele sothini siyaphila. Anganampuphu nginempuphu siyapheka siyadla soyi-2. Impilo iyaqhubeka. Ngithola i-peace job ngoba yena kana-ID benza i-peace job ngihole thenga impuphu ngapha thenga impuphu ngale impilo iyaqhubeka.
Wow. I think watching this video, I'm just so taken aback because I knew the title of the video, but I don't know what I was expecting to see because I think I've had such a single story of our mining sector. I'll say that for now, even though we are going to dive deeper into land issues and political economy. But I think I've had a single idea of our mining sector, where we see videos of men being the backbone, of men working underground and being the force, the workforce that produce all these minerals that are part of the political economy. And even with the work that's been done for men, we can see now that there has been a shift where there has been an acknowledgement of past wrongdoings. And we've seen amends being made, or well, an attempted amends being made, where we see that now protective gear is being made available in mines, and that there is compensation being made available for certain illnesses that have been experienced as a result of working in mines. It never even occurred to me that there's actually women in the background, women who are actually taking care of this workforce, women who are probably wives, sisters, families of this workforce that's making mining even possible, and that they have no land, that they are also inhaling these fumes, that they are actually taking care of this workforce, yet they are not recognized. So I want to jump straight to you, Star, and maybe just start off by asking, why do you think the role of women in mining is so untouched when attempting to expose and rectify the injustices that have been experienced in this sector? And how does that make you feel? What are your thoughts on it?
Thank you, Anele, for the question. I think feminist scholars, feminist activists have over the years taught us that in capitalism, the work of women, which is very central actually, but tends to be sidelined and not recognized because it's seen as unpaid, what they call care work. Now you are saying the women are actually taking care of this workforce, and that is what is in feminist discourse is called social reproduction or care work, unpaid work that is predominantly performed by women. Now, mining companies, or just not just mining companies, most industries, a worker is then seen as the person who actually comes to work. If work starts at 8 until 5, the worker is that person who is there from 8 until 5. Now, feminists are asking us what happens before 8 o'clock in the morning, before the worker gets to work, and what happens after 5 when the worker leaves work. Who is taking care of the worker? Who is reproducing the worker so that the worker is ready again 8 o'clock in the morning to start and produce and for the capitalists to accumulate profit. Now, that is the work of women, which is invisible. A lot of scholars have written about that. If we talk about mining in particular, colleague and comrade, for example, Dr. Asanda Benge has written about the invisible work that is done by, she was referring to the Marikana women, that they are nowhere to be seen in the discourse around what happened in Marikana, around what happened underground, yet they are the people who are actually making sure that workers are at work at 9, at 8, and they come back the following day, every day. And that is the problem. That is the problem of capitalism. And it's not just in mining. In many other sectors, be it in agriculture, everywhere where there's a labor force, people who are at work, somebody is taking care of them. And that labor of taking care of them, making sure they've got clean clothes, making sure that they're psychologically ready to begin the work. Because at work, the boss wants you ready and productive, which means the boss wants your stomach full, you're physically fit to produce and make money. But they're not interested who does that work. And in most cases, the wages are so limited that to take care of workers outside after 5 also is eating up on women's time and on women's labor, which is unpaid. You also mentioned briefly about people getting sick from mining, and we saw that in the documentary, people getting sick. I mean, it's an old story of mining. People getting sick, and when they are sick, they are no longer fit because the mining bosses want you fit. Once you are sick because of working underground for years, you are no longer needed. Your labor is no longer needed, and then you have to be sent back home. And who takes care of you when you're back at home? It's women who are taking care, and nobody's giving them extra money to take care of you, to buy your medication. No, that's you have to see where you get that from. But not only that, they are taking care of those who are no longer wanted by these industries because they are now sick. Women also have to give birth to those who will take over. And we know the history of mining that often you hear, oh, my father was a mine worker, my grandfather was a mine worker, and my uncle. It's generational. So while your father is a mine worker, you are still a young boy, and women are taking care of you, raising you so that at the particular age, when your father is sent back, you go there, and again, you come back when you're sick, and then the cycle just continues. So, yeah, let me just stop there for now.
Mm.
We can't hear you, Anele.
Thank you very much. I muted myself. Lance, your thoughts on this, please?
Yeah, I think both you, Anela, and Star has raised really important points. And I suppose my reflections after watching this video was and also the writer and the director's deliberate use of the naturalization the naturalization of the exclusion of women, right, and showing kind of the devaluing of labor. And I mean, this is historicized, and I know that Star reflects on the op-ed written about land and in relation to this conversation, the importance of kind of the understanding of, for me, bodies and the deliberate exclusion of women in so-called productive economies. So whose bodies are fit for productivity, whose bodies are fit for labor, what labor is valued, and the conditions and the consequences of work must always be under question when the recruitment of bodies are selective. And I think that I also understand that in a South African, context, and also globally, I mean, we understand that the conditions of mining and many other sectors in South Africa, linked to the conversation of labor and productive work for both men and women, are not decent and does not advance freedom, equity, security, and human dignity. And it's important to name that truth. And yet, women, despite their significant contribution to the extraction of valuable resources in the ways that Star has mentioned, the kind of labor, the care work, the social reproduction labor that women do, they very much frequently excluded from the sector and in these conversations about compensation, redress. And that's important. And so, Black women's contribution to the South African economies and women's paid and unpaid, valued or unvalued labor is the backbone of the South African economy. And so it is important to name that truth in any conversation about socio-political and economic redress and justice. And so, so I think at various levels, we need to hold that truth within its complexity. I think my final point is also linked to Star's contribution, is also the recognition of the complex social arrangements for the ways in which the South African mining industry has been set up by the apartheid and colonial, state, that history that we set up, that kind of the forms of masculinities that are nurtured in those spaces, that are then echoed in the ways in which we are structurally struggling with violent masculinities and different kind of forms of issues, traumas that are being, that women have to bear the brunt of. So women's lives are affected by the traumas that men bring to them. And women have to deal with these traumas in very different ways. And so we need to also be frank about the intentional colonial and apartheid design, and that the intention was to break the Black family communities. It was thought of to have this implication on both Black men and women. And I think that emphasis is important. And another tactic of domination and control. And yet women are left out, made it possible for men to be exploited because women are doing the care work. These mining companies are not, considering the psychosocial work, the mental health work. So women are picking up the pieces, and they are really bearing the brunt, actually. Men are being exploited and women bear the brunt at the end of the day. So I think, that's my contribution. Thanks, Anela.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lance. And that is actually just so true. That I like that you mentioned how it did start in the apartheid regime, and how patriarchy was the state of the order of the day, and it kind of really still is. I want to ask, at the start of the film, we see that there's a legislation that is passed that says women are not allowed to work in the mines. What goes through your mind when you see this legislation, that women are now again being excluded from the political economy, from even being able to earn or make a living? Do you see this as an exclusion or a form of erasure at this point? Or how do you think that actually plays a role in where we are now and the invisibility of women in our political economy? You can start, sir.
Oh. Okay, well, yeah, I mean, mining has always been known to be quite a masculine area of work. Women were involved, but not underground, but just on the surface. And that's because of how the construction of who the miner should be. I mean, it's understood that it's hard work, you need to have muscle. A lot of scholars who've written about mining work and the construction of this body have written about that, saying it's not that it's natural that a particular body can work in the mine. Actually, since mines have allowed women to work, we've seen women working underground, even though there's enormous challenges, but there's nothing particular about a particular body physically that it cannot work the mine, it cannot hold the machine, it cannot do this. But again, this is in a way the way that women are positioned in society, and like you're saying, it's still very much visible today in the kinds of work that women are able to do. Even if you go to farms, I do most of my research on farms. You find that it's still very rare that you find women doing technical work, not because they can't do technical work, not because they can't operate a machine, they can't drive a tractor. Anybody can do that. It's a skill that anybody can learn to operate a machine and adjust things. But because historically, women have not been included in those kinds of training and that kind of work because they have to stay at home and look after children and take care of the elderly and the sick. And so that is perpetuated. Even today, you see the kind of work that women do. They do work that is, they earn the least. On farms, like I was making an example, it's mainly men who are driving tractors. And of course, if you're driving a tractor, you earn more money than someone who's just using a hoe to pick whatever that they need to pick, weeds and stuff. So women would do those kind of work because it's unskilled. And it's sort of like acceptable that no, well, you can't let them do the machines, but the machines are the jobs that are paying higher, and they're all reserved for men. Only now that things are changing a little, but the attitude, it's still very much masculine in the sense that if you're thinking of who's going to operate the machine, it's a man, and not the women. And women again then end up doing those tasks that pay very little. Such as they must clean, do laundry, and so on. And we know those jobs, how much they pay in all the industries. Mm.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thank you for actually raising that, because the one thing that comes to my mind as you are speaking, Star, is that honestly, the value of a Black woman hasn't been recognized nor optimized in this country, and perhaps even just in society. Lance, do you think this legislation was probably a gateway into women being excluded from the political economy of the country? And do you think perhaps law does actually have a role to play in rectifying or even making amends when it comes to basically putting women on the map when it comes to political economy?
That's a difficult question. So in the question about women's erasure, yes, I definitely think so. I mean, in South Africa in particular, we've seen how legal reform, South Africa is quite an interesting country in the sense that when you have law reform and you advocate and you have the legal aspects of things, it's an important, I suppose, mechanism to facilitate social change. Obviously the challenge for me is kind of is the law sufficient? Is legal reform sufficient for changing the lived realities for women on the ground? So that's something that I'm really grappling with. But I think what's important for me is, so I definitely think that, even just in my psyche and in my being before watching this documentary, like in my imagination, in this conversation of minds and even the conversations about land and farms, like in my own psyche, I couldn't access or couldn't understand or imagine that women can take up these forms of labor. And that's important to recognize how our conditioning in the conversation of labor and languaging such as hard labor, etc., is very masculinized. And I think that that it's again the conversation about bodies and obviously intersections between gender and race, right? Black male bodies. And so I also think that what's important is that we cannot have a conversation about advocacy, law reform, without also thinking about asking the questions of what is the role of mining companies in South Africa? What is the role between government and mining companies that give them so much power over Black bodies in particular, right? And what is the structural arrangements and agreements that historically and contemporary systems are still colonial in its operation? And so the same beneficiaries who are controlling the economy are still the same masters who are employing, exploiting, and dispossessing. And I think that's important. And many of these mining companies also evade taxes. And if we think about law, legal instrumentation, you cannot have a conversation about shifting law without the conversation about tax, right? And also, I mean, for me, it's also the key argument of what compensation is needed, right? And that, for me, that's a basic income tax question. That conversation is important for the need to have a basic income grant for women in precarious positions. It is a structural arrangement that is limiting women to access economies, to access money, education, food, mental health services. And there are numerous studies that show that women who have been given compensation for conditions of violence and illness have shown improvements in their livelihoods. And it's not kind of this normative narrative of, alcohol will be bought or drugs will be used for these kinds of social welfare. So I think there is a conversation there. And so it is the responsibility of Treasury to take a multi-pronged intersectoral approach. And you can see also with COVID, how we've been talking about compensation, about grants and social welfare, and especially in relation to social reproduction. I'll pause there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lance. You raise extremely crucial points that would probably need another webinar just to declutter or just to make sure that we tackle them properly. But we are going to touch on a few of them in this in this webinar. I want to jump to. I'm still feeling a bit emotional from watching that film, so I'm trying to gather myself. But what stuck out for me in the film is the clear erasure of women through being undocumented. I think I didn't realize that it would actually, even though the topic is undocumented women and mines, that it could actually be so literal. I mean, in this day and age, for some people in South Africa, getting an ID is not as simple as being taken to Home Affairs and having your picture taken and mentioning your names and getting an ID. We see that there's communities that struggle to get some form of documentation. This means that they're not able to apply for government grants, which you were just talking about, Lance. They're not able to apply for government housing. They're not able to even be part of the conversation. And what even bothers me more is the fact that if there's an undocumented person, that means even their issues, even their ailments, whatever misfortunes they're dealing with, those go undocumented as well. Because how do I complain if I technically don't exist? And it enrages me because I feel like we've got communities around certain sectors. I'm not going to say mines because it's not just in mines. It's just that, yes, we were watching a documentary on undocumented women in mines, but we've got communities that exist that are being erased as they exist. I don't know if I'm making sense. They're there, but people are undocumented, and so they're not able to even be part of the equation. They're not able to fight for their rights, and especially housing issues. It now makes sense why there is housing issues, because if they are undocumented, they're not even able to apply for what is rightfully theirs. Tar, do you want to jump in this? What are your thoughts? How does that make you feel? And what stuck out for you in the film?
Well, I mean, we have a crisis in our country. I mean, it's not just in our country, actually. It's in the continent, and you could say it's global, in the global south in particular. We have a crisis of social reproduction. We have a crisis of poverty. I mean, what you saw in that video is just a microcosm of what's happening in the country. We have so many people who are unemployed and who are not likely going to be employed anytime soon. We have an economic system that does not need their labor. Now, what happens when your labor is no longer needed? What happens? And so we need to be thinking really about reforms that take into account the crisis that we are sitting in. We are sitting with. If you think historically, because what we're seeing today has its history, systematic. Historically, the people who worked in the mines when the mines were discovered for the first time in the 1800s, those were originally the black peasantry. Those were black peasants who lived and fed their families and themselves through agriculture, through farming. The country was agrarian. The economy was agrarian at the time. And when the mines were discovered, which happened, I mean, of course, after the colonial settlers, when the mines were discovered, then there was a need for people to go and work in the mines. Now, nobody was going to go and work in the mines if they were farming and they were fine. So they had to be forced into mining. So it was always a violent act right from the start. People were dispossessed of their land, dispossessed of their livelihood, dispossessed of their independence, and forced into this kind of labor. And then they had to work there for centuries. And we know the outcomes. We've seen the outcomes. We know what happens in mining towns. I'm not going to go into that. But now today, we have this crisis that now these people are no longer needed by the mines. We heard in the film, they're saying, well, to get a job in the mine, come on, nobody gets job. I mean, also, how many people can one mine employ? So now we have this, what Marxists call surplus people, surplus population whose labor is no longer needed by capital, and then just hanging in there. Now the question then comes, can reforms such as land redistribution address such a crisis, and to what extent? And to a big extent, yes, land reform can address this crisis, because then you give people land, and people need housing. Like you were saying, housing is also a land issue. It's not just production, but you've got to do that in a way that is different to the kind of a system that we have today. The economic system that we have does not allow for that. We have a system that only allows a few to accumulate capital and accumulate profits, while the majority is just abandoned, just staying there in the street. You walk outside now in the street, you're going to find thousands of young people who are not working. You go to rural areas, it's the same thing. Thousands of people who are not working. So we need also like a reform in the economy, in how the economy is structured. We have an economy that is so versatile for inequality. It reproduces inequality over and over again. You can redistribute land, but if the terms and conditions are still framed within this kind of production where you need a few to be in charge and you're putting machines and stuff, then you're not really addressing we need a total rethink of the economy, because the crisis, it can't go on like this, and we are seeing signs every day that it cannot go on like this. The July unrest in KZN and in some parts of Gauteng were one of the examples that we see that we have so much inequality. It's so unsustainable that the country is banning, and it's going to continue to ban unless we rethink the economy. Len's point about redistribution, how wealth needs to be redistributed, is one element of it. You redistribute land, but also you redistribute income. People need an income, and a basic income grant would be a good start for people. Where I do my research, I ask people, so do you want jobs here on these farms? I do my research on farms, people living on farms who've claimed land or who are waiting for their land claims. What are your visions? What do you think should be the new or the future rural South Africa? And people tell me, no, we're not looking for jobs, for farm jobs, because also they are so exploitative, these jobs. I mean, we talk about these jobs as if they are humane. Some of them are so inhumane. People are earning 500 Rand per month, and they have to work from 4 in the morning without any protective clothing. It's also a mess. And people say, no, but come on, what about our dignity? Let's not work, right? And we shouldn't be told that we should be grateful just because we are working, just earning 500 Rand per month. And they say, well, we can be self-employed. If we have land and there is infrastructure, we can raise livestock. Where I work, people are raising livestock. It's goats and cattle, because the area is good for that. And they're not even asking for much, just put infrastructure, make sure there's water, make sure there's irrigation for those who want to produce, and then make sure there's local markets. These things are possible. They are done in other countries. We just need it. You need those local food hubs that municipalities can support, and you invest in small scale agriculture in all these rural areas where people are claiming land back. But it's not happening. Instead, what's happening is people are given land back, and then they are expected to produce in the same way. Now, the same way that the previous white commercial farmers have been producing, forgetting that the previous white farmers have been producing in that particular way because of the kind of support they were getting from the apartheid government, all those marketing boards, all those subsidies that they were getting, plus cheap labor of Black people. Now, are you saying now people must continue like that? They're not getting those subsidies anymore. The state is not providing that. They're not getting support in terms of their marketing. They're not getting that state cushioning that white farmers used to get. On top of that, they're not going to get Black people to provide Black cheap labor. Now, what you're not addressing the problem. You need a total reconstruction of the entire system. And that's what we really need to be thinking about. I've said a lot. Let me pause.
Yeah. Thank you so much. You really do shed light on a lot of points, because I think just like many systems are often multifaceted, and I think we often look at the most annoying issue at that time, or the most problematic issue at that time, and we forget about the other areas. And I think you've put it so well when you say we could talk about land reform, but there's also the political reform, economic reform. Like, everything does need to be looked at, and in order for it to even be sustained properly, and to ensure that people, Black people, also do have just an equal opportunity at being human in this society. I want to jump on what you said. Lance, do you think women should be compensated for their role in these sectors? Mine sectors, just farms, women that we have seen, like what Star was talking about earlier, that we tend to look at workforce as people who punch in from 8 o'clock until 4 o'clock. And we forget about the caretakers before 8 and after 8 that have to look after these people. We forget about the women, like just the women in general. Do you think there should be some form of compensation in sectors where the women have been excluded, oppressed, and borderline abused because they are expected to be there in order for the that sector to even exist? And what do you think that should look like today, taking into account what Star was talking about, economic reform and so on? Just your thoughts.
Thanks, Anele. And I think that, as obviously, as someone who hasn't done research in the space and also have not, do not have close proximity to the particular issues that the woman represented in this particular story, it's very difficult to say what that compensation should look like. And I definitely think that from my previous comments around, the conversations of the basic income grant, that yes, of course, compensation should be there. And I also think that again, it's about trying to understand what social welfare should look like, what the responsibility is from treasurer, but also what are the responsibilities of these big corporations, like, for example, your Anglo-Americans, etc. So in the mining sector, and for me, it is about also be able to also ask the question of, like Star said, why should women be laboring underground when these companies are pocketing, and so I suppose as someone who's really serious about the importance of centering women in these reforms, the kind of justice and redress that's important for this work, I ask myself, where do we put our emphasis? And how do we hold the complexities of the issue? So where do we place our focus? Is it the corporations? But also at the same time, how do we bring light to the pain, the challenges, the suffering, but also the agency of the women who are experiencing who are in these very precarious situations, economically, socially, and politically. And we are still, just a reflection on climate justice and what's happening with the whales and Shell. This whole conversation around narratives. We are not centering African women and Black African women in particular sufficiently in these conversations. And, we know the implications of climate justice and injustices and the consequences on Black women. So where do we place our focus? So I think that, this is a big conversation. And I think that, we need to be able to understand the full, and it's what Danny Bolo was reflecting on, can women be understood in the full complexity of their being, even in the conversations of compensation, and also how we need to challenge these skewed narratives. The narratives of women's contribution not being valued needs to be, challenged. It needs to be corrected. And we need to go back to the archive, and there are so many feminist scholars, Black and African feminist scholars writing these narratives into the archive. This film even is part of the offering into that Black feminist historiography. So I'm reflecting on in the conversation of compensation, whose gaze do we reinforce when we think about compensation for Black women in relation to political economy, right? And I mean, this film reflects the agency, that is there, and so a reflection on our role is important, as people working in the space, and the learnings that's being echoed by the feminist scholars that we're engaging with, and Nolwazi Tusini said it really well in the first event of this series, is that the women they have agency and they have voice. They just need to be activated and honored. And so I think part of that honoring is to be able to directly center them in the conversation. And I think this is why this, the conversation is so important, and why this ReaBua is so important.
Thank you. I think when we think back to the apartheid regime and the racialized hierarchy of the political economy, and it basically placing women at the very bottom, because even today we do know that the most privileged person in society is a straight white male, and Black women are at the bottom of that. What do you think our individual responsibility is, taking into account our personal positionality and our proximity? And feel free to reference some of the work that you do, in this regard. Tai, you can
go. Thanks, Anele, for the question. I mean, these are structural problems, and maybe we should not think about individual responses. By that I mean the problems are structural, they are systematic, and so our approach to responding and trying to address this problem should also be systematic and structural. And sometimes if we individualize the problem, then we don't address it. I'll give you an example of why I'm saying that. For example, we have a structural problem of climate change, right? Everybody is talking about climate change, and we see it. We see the impact of climate change. If you speak to farmers, they tell you that, we can see the changes in our soil. We can see the patterns in our animals, what they eat, what they can't eat anymore, and so on. They are making all these observations, right? And so if you think about the causes of climate change, much research points to fossil fuels, the way that our economy is structured, and particularly the global north, countries in the West, who are the ones who are really, really the big consumers and who are contributing so much to climate change. But when you think about, if you look at the responses, some people would just say, well, you need to start walking more, use a bicycle instead of making it an individual, like a lifestyle kind of response, or no, stop eating meat, be a vegan. I mean, those, of course, I'm sure they do contribute, but those are just individualistic kind of responses to really political problems, right? Political and social problems. So I think we need to be, I mean, there's already a lot that is happening in South Africa. There's lots of civil society organizations, activists in rural areas doing amazing work, trying to organize, but because the environment is so cruel, the priority for people is survival, right? So for some people to organize, I mean, I think we need to be organizing more, doing more advocacy, doing research on alternatives, putting these alternatives up front. When we're saying no to mining, like in other communities, they are saying no to mining, but they are putting something else that could create livelihoods and dignity for people, which is not mining. Like we know about the Bologna case, they've been saying for years. We can do tourism that is community driven. We have beautiful landscapes here. The government, if the government is interested in developing this community, they can meet us halfway. They can invest in that kind of tourism. They can invest in agriculture in this community. There has been research done. So we need more of that kind of research where people are putting forward alternatives. It is happening. I'm not saying it's not happening, but I'm just saying we need more of that, and supporting activism, supporting activists who are organizing, but not forgetting that the challenge, especially for people who are affected directly, for someone who is hungry now and is thinking about what I'm going to eat for dinner today, the most immediate thing is, okay, it's survival. It's survival rather than thinking about policy change, which is something that ourselves, because we sort of in a more privileged position, then we spend most of our time engaging at that kind of level. But for people who are affected directly, it's sometimes not easy to be in the forefront and always be fighting. We saw in the documentary, they start by saying, well, we still coal, right? Because that is how we survive. And we know about that. They call it weapons of the weak. It's for their survival. And they organize, because poor people also very smart, and they organize with the workers that, okay, which is a good day for us to come and steal. Now, for them, it's, if I don't steal my bucket of coal today, then there won't be food in this household today, right? So there's that happening on the one hand. And on the other hand, we are saying we need more structural changes, we need policy changes, which don't happen overnight, of course. And so our role as researchers and activists is really to be pushing and working and supporting these communities in a way that we can. But ultimately, we need to push for policy change and push for an alternative kind of economic system in South Africa.
Thanks. Lance, same question, but I'd like to know, what do you think? Thank you, Star, for actually raising that. Perhaps we shouldn't be looking at our individual input and maybe look at our collective mandate as society. So Lance, I'd like you to jump right into that and perhaps tell me what you think our collective mandate is as humans and as male bodies, because I think we are lucky to have you in this conversation, even though we are tackling the erasure of women. But as male bodies and perhaps marginalized bodies who don't necessarily identify in men identifying spaces, just making sure that you are in solidarity and allyship with this mandate.
That's quite just echoing Star's reflection about the importance of understanding the responsibility, as being in quite a privileged position, understanding policy, understanding, legislature, understanding advocacy, what is my role in for someone who is committed to the liberation and redress of Black women in particular. What does that mean? And you speak about allyship and solidarity, and it's difficult work. And I think for actually, it's not that difficult, right? Because there's an archive, like I said, of feminist scholars and Black women in this network who are framing the strategies for advocacy, for understanding, and it's really just about entering in and understanding where to enter in, and understanding how to, using obviously and trusting the leadership that is being crafted here. And this ReaBua is really a beautiful space in which Black women have been leading and Black feminist thought. And it's really been so powerful to be able to be in a space of guidance and support, I suppose, to understanding, and it really brings to life this kind of quote that I always refer back to by decolonial feminists of Floretta Bonzaya and Chose Kesi, that actually, Black women are the experts of their own lives, and the most marginalized in society, are the most knowledgeable about the challenges they face. and the aspects of the daily lives that need to change. So I do think that, you know, in everything that we do, the responsibility is to listen, to learn as part of that, you know, radical advocacy that we're doing. But it's also the responsibility to be reflexive, to understand your positionality, to understand your proximity to experience, your limitations to the experience and the knowledge, and also understanding your biases in responsiveness, understand your own individual paternalism in this, you know, in how you reproduce the same systems that we're trying to confront and address and dismantle, your own saviorship and your potential to be patronizing in your embodiment and your being, despite your best intentions. So that's just at an individual level, and also how we build solidarity across these different issues, because they are intersectional. I mean, this whole conversation about mining has been, you know, quite binary in the gender, in the kind of the gender, in gender terms, like men and women, and what are the complexity of experiences in this conversation that's required to move forward, you know, a radical shift in these systems and structures, and then also how we advocate for these issues.
Yeah. Thank you, Lance. I think it's Dethra Giles who actually says, I'm going to quote her, and I'd love for you to just give me your thoughts on this, because I do think erasure is used as a tool. Writing out narrative in history secures our people's place in time, or else you start from scratch. And there's nothing glorious about every generation starting from the bottom. And I think, Star, you did mention that there's a lot of people doing a lot of things. And how do we ensure that not every single generation starts from the bottom? We've been talking about how women have been erased from the narrative in South Africa, from the narrative in society, their contributions, their lives, in every area, not just politically. If we're talking about Mama Tikizela Mandela, I mean, I think I read somewhere that she was the first medical social worker, but it's never really said that way, because it is a form of erasure. We were just told that she was a social worker. And we know as well that during apartheid, the hierarchy was to remove women completely. You know, the political economy was supposed to exist without the women. And I think when it was seen that it cannot exist without the women, they were then suppressed to menial roles, or roles that were seen as menial, because I don't want to call them menial, but like roles that were only seen as teaching or nursing, or caretakers, and a lot of other roles that are still undocumented roles where people are still giving labor for that. And I think, I mean, growing up, if I take from my own experience, my mom was a teacher, and I remember a lot of people that would grow up. I mean, she was a teacher for about 40 years. So we got to meet a lot of people that were now professionals that started off with her. And whenever we would see them, and almost everyone around me was a teacher. Whenever we would see these people, they would give money, you know what I mean, as a form of appreciation, like, or just as a gift to say, it was almost like standing in solidarity and saying, I recognize that the contribution you put into me is not being as recognized by society, or what you are making is not nearly what you should be making for what you have put into me. So how do we make sure, because now we do still have certain professions, we do still have a lot of erasures happening, a lot of areas where women are excluded, whether it's protected by legislation, whether it's just unspoken cultural knowledge, but women are being erased from a lot of. How do we make sure that the work that we are doing now, because as Lance said, I think these ReaBua dialogues are an amazing part of being the resistance against erasure. You know, this is a historiography that will last the times. So how do you, and I guess it is a step in making sure that each generation doesn't start from scratch. But yeah, how do we make sure that we carry on in that way, and that, you know, the baton does move forward, so that we're not finding the next generation sitting down here dealing with these very same things. And we're talking about the need for economic reform, we're talking about the need for land reform. How do we make sure that the work we do is structured properly, and then is able to be moved forward by the next person? I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it's good. I think we must just keep on doing what we're doing. The world is so is not friendly to women. It's not friendly to Black women. The infrastructures, the systems in place are against Black women, because everything was put in place not with the Black women in mind. So if you think about the academy, the universities in South Africa, it's always a shock when they tell you that this university only has this number of black women professors, you know, because it was just something that was unheard of, or something that was systematically suppressed. That no, you are not going to be a professor. You are going to stay at home and raise children, because we need your children to come and work and make money for white capitalists. So everything in place has been put. So the challenge now is that we just always have to work extra hard, always have to push back to make ourselves visible, and only us can do it. Nobody else is going to do it for ourselves. So we have young scholars who are going into the archives. I think about Dr. Atambile's work, where she goes into the archives and wants to write about the amazing women who were writing, who were poets, who were writers in the 1930s, in the 1900s. And it's only through doing that we'll get to know about them. Because if the young writers today are not going to do that, then we're not going to know. So it's really a challenge for us to run with it, and hopefully those of us who are engaging with younger people, who are teaching in classrooms, or who are part of activist movement in communities where we do kind of education, and that's what we also try and do there. Because yeah, I mean, everything is for whether it's about publishing, whether it's about whose work needs to be taught in the classroom, it's always a struggle. It's going to be white men's papers that are pushed, that are in everyone's curriculum. Yeah, so it's you just always have to be deliberate. That no, actually, I want to find work by women. There's lots of women who've written amazing work all over our continent. It's a question of I want to find that work, and I want to cite that work in my own work, and in that way you make it visible. Otherwise, yeah, we're just gonna. But I'm not saying it's easy, because, like I said, these things are systematic. So if everything is put in place to suppress you, it's very difficult. But we just have to keep on pushing and keep on writing. And I think women are doing amazing work. I think it was Lens who cited Professor Casey and Professor Bonzai, that women are experts in their own histories. And I was reminded, we were doing some work with my colleague and partner, doing family schools with women living on farms and women living in mining towns. And we were doing them in Zulu and Xhosa and Sesotho, because that's the language that they speak. And it was our first time to be doing the kind of work in that environment, where we're talking about feminism, patriarchy, and having to do it in our own languages. And we're realizing, hey, we are running out of vocabulary, actually, because we're so used to doing this in English. And one of the women said, when we're doing the evaluation at the end, and she said, this workshop has been so great, because we didn't have translators for the change, because usually they go to workshops and there has to be a translator, because things are in English. And then she said, for the first time, we don't have to translate our our experiences. We don't have to translate our lives. And that's exactly what we were doing in those workshops, in any case, talking about their lives. Because how else do you explain patriarchy except from listening to a Black woman just sharing their experiences? And that there you have the definition of patriarchy, and then she will say, well, we didn't have to. It's so good not to have to translate our experiences, which I thought was quite powerful. So I think that's my view, that we just have to keep pushing and get those experiences and get those voices and those stories using the platforms that we have access to, and just continue writing and continue having this kind of dialogues, which like the one that Tekano has been doing, which I thought they were really fantastic. Yeah.
Thanks. Lance, your thoughts on how we can ensure that the baton does actually move forward, and we don't necessarily have to start from scratch with each generation. And I think if you would love to touch on what Star just brought up, just even being in your native country and finding that you are not able to express yourself when it comes to certain issues because we are so used to dealing with them in a foreign language, and now finding herself struggling to do it in vernac.
I mean, Star put it beautifully, actually. I can't even add to that contribution, because it's really that. And I mean, it's about trying to also understand, what the relationship between knowledge, experience, and the importance of this archive that we are building. Because what we are doing is that we are challenging normative discourses. We're challenging erasure, and part of the reclamation and building that archive is to move away from colonial ways of being and doing. And it's easy to say, but it's liberating when you can find spaces that enable that. And I think that it's not always going to be perfect. It's not always, because we are all colonized, right? And we're part of these systems. But it's that kind of everyday negotiation and decisions that we make in using our agency to I guess move against the structures, move against the systems, to constantly challenge power. And like Star beautifully put it, it's like our every, I'm in the academy, it's about, who I read, who I reference, who I bring in to teach. That really disrupts the kind of normative ways in which, the realities of the subaltern has been constructed and continue to be constructed and internalized.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm not sure if you guys would like to, Lance, you can actually go first if you would like to mention any work that you do that you can say is in line with assisting women in any form, because as we have said, erasure happens in many different layers. And so any form of work that we do, I feel like it is important to acknowledge publicly and to recognize, so that we can start building these archives that Star was talking about, so that our narrative is in our own words. And I think for transformational learning to even take place, we have to really be vulnerable enough to be honest with our own stories. And I like that you mentioned that we first have to acknowledge and accept that we are colonized. And then we can move forward to see how we can then start to dismantle the system, because it is a system and it won't just be one solution that deals with it. But I certainly do think that controlling our narrative or protecting our narrative is one form of it. So any work that you do that you would like to mention, this is your opportunity.
Thanks, Anele. I don't think I'm going to visibilize my own labor to doing that. I think, the advocacy that I do is in support of sex work and decriminalization of sex work. I'll visibilize the women I work with in those spaces, and that's Duduzile Dlamini, who works with Sweat. There are so many women, Tlaleng Mafekeng. There are so many Black women in particular who has been leading and supporting me in being able to do this work. Sis Lebu, the CEO of Tekano, Crystal, so there's a Severa, there's a, even Star. So there are so many, there's Shanaz, there's Kense. I mean, it's endless, both in this community, in the UCT kind of broad, collective. So I think that it's important to visibilize those women, and I actually wish I could have prepared a list of those women, if because
shout out.
it's so difficult to bring them into the space to visibilize their work, because they are the ones who are leading in the space, and my role is to facilitate and support social change advocacy. And of course, they equally also support my own positionality and my own liberation, and my own subjectivity in relation to marginality. And it's important to recognize, like I said, the archive is there, and I think it's about the visibilization of women is so important. Black women in particular, the reclamation, this kind of counter erasure narrative is so important, and I think it's important for us to say that the archive is there, right? And
Absolutely.
as a male body, it's important to consult that archive and understand how to navigate that archive, and more importantly, like I said, listen and take the leadership of Black women in the space. Thanks.
Thank you. And Star, is there any work that you would love to highlight right now and make visible?
Well, I mean, I'm currently I'm writing my PhD thesis, and I spent 3 months in one farm in KZN called Mhlopeni, and I was so privileged to do life histories with women who used to be labor tenants in the 1960s, 1950s, who've seen forced removals, who've experienced it themselves, whose husband and son were sent to by force to go and work in the mines. And I've just been collecting this information, sitting down with them for 2 hours, and they were so generous with their time, just documenting what was life in 1955 as a labor tenant when you were 15 years old. And they would just, and yeah, it's just such amazing information, which I think should be out there. In fact, I was speaking to the young people on these farms, just asking them, do you know the history of your grandmother? Do you know that they used to work in this way, and this is how they were abused, and they used to work for free for 6 months without getting paid? And today they are saying, where is our money? Where is the compensation question? And some of the young people were like, no, we actually don't know. I've never asked my grandmother, actually. But I thought, oh, maybe it would be great if I mean, of course, there's always a question of resources, but to have some sort of a project where you can say, okay, each and every grandchild in this household should interview their grandparents, because we need that history, and it can be documented in vernacular. We can translate it if you want it to be shared, of course, but take a photo of your grandmother and just write it down, what really happened, if we want to really understand the impact of all these cruel laws that were passed, the 1913 Native Land Act, for example. And I was reading Saul Blackie recently, where he was walking around, meeting people in the street who were just evicted after the law was passed, and asking them, so where are you going? What's happening? And just, I felt like, wow, I was there in 1913, although I wasn't, just from reading the way that he narrates the story of, I met this man, I met this woman, they were carrying a baby, and this is what they said, the baby had died, they were scared to bury the child, they'd just been evicted, they had to wait until it's stuck, dig a trench in the street and bury their loved one. Those kind of stories now, I mean, and that is very important because we talk about redress today. We say, oh, we need land reform for redress. But actually, when I read policies, I'm like, do people even know what really happened? Because if we talk about redress, we need to have a very clear picture of what really happened. And it's through these kind of life histories from people who were there that we can really get a clear picture of when we say compensation. We're not just saying compensation because it's a buzzword, but it's because here is a woman who's now 88 years, and this is what happened to them. And their house was burnt. Their cattle were taken by force. And today hasn't received a cent. And you know what I mean? So it's I'm very grateful to have that kind of opportunity. And I think we must just do more of that. And today there's technology, so it's not even those who don't want to write, things that can be put on camera, things can be put on video, and we can get to hear more of this narrative from rural women who are often very marginalized, and we don't really get to know much about them. Even in history, we usually know about women who were elite, who were in urban areas, who were educated. We hardly hear about the poor ones in rural areas, and that's what I'm trying to do in my work.
Thank you so much. I love how you approached your projects, basically just going in with no clear preconceived notions, but going in and listening so that you really do bring out the issues that are experienced in that community. I think, and it really resonates with me when you talk about history in our households, because I'm Bondo, I'm from Lusikisiki, and it's a very small group of people. And even in trying to find literature or even some form of history, I really do struggle. And I've had this idea of perhaps creating a video, where I ask the relevant questions, to the older people, because the older people are dying and they're dying with their knowledge. And I think that's always been our issue as Black people. It's not that we didn't have a way of doing things. It's not that we didn't have knowledge of certain things, but because they're undocumented and normally passed from one person to another, then they do somehow disappear or they get twisted. So now I want to move along and bring the health equity argument, and when it comes to our work. So as a Tekano Fellow, we each get to do a project that is dear to our hearts. It's very much open as long as it does somehow address a health equity issue. So I'm a pharmacist by profession, and for my project, I decided to go back to Emambondweni. Like I said, I'm Bondo, and I feel like it's a very marginalized, unknown small group of people. And I went there thinking, okay, I'm a pharmacist, I just want to see their access to medication. I went with the preconceived notion, which is what I think is usually an issue with a lot of NGOs that come, with funding from outside. But I quickly had to change everything when I got there, because I realized that it was not going to work if I went with existing questions. So instead, I basically made myself available to them to listen to their issues. And the main issue that came up was, in this day and age, after apartheid, today, there are still women who have to walk 40 plus kilometers. Actually, not just women, men as well, 40 plus kilometers to get to the nearest clinic. They have to go to another village. Because I think there's a mishap in the law, because there has to be a certain number of people in an area for a clinic to exist, or whatnot. And so location then isn't taken into account. And in walking, you find that because the road isn't, in order for them to walk for a shorter distance, they have to use a road that is that goes through Umzimvubu River. Umzimvubu River is in between two oceans in Port St. John's, and it's a very big river. And so they were saying how many people have actually drowned just trying to cross the river to get to a clinic, because they'll look at it and think, oh, the current is low, and then they try and cross, but then the current comes, and then the police are called. They have to go with the dogs and look for the people and so on. So this is an existing issue that is known. And there are women basically talking in this documentary. So I took a backseat and I basically just gave them the lens and they told their own stories. I'm still going to launch it. I'll let you guys know. But yeah, they were basically talking about how women have no access to contraceptives. And in trying to get to the clinic, they get raped. It's a known thing that if you're looking for people to rape, there might be women who try to go to the clinic and so on. And I think that really opened my eyes to, even though I'm a scientist, I'm a clinical person because that's how I've been trained. But so much happens behind the scenes before a person even gets to a clinic. The social issues that take place, the social issues that have to be addressed in making sure that people even have access to healthcare. I think even in the case of undocumented women and mines, where you are determines what kind of healthcare you will get access to. You know, if you live in a certain area, you will have access to a clinic that is there. If you live in a more affluent area, you'll have access to the clinic that's in that area. What do you think, when it comes to those health inequalities and the work that you do, or even things that you have seen? What would you love to say when it comes to social issues that affect health equity in South Africa, taking into account land reform and anything else that you would love to reference? Anyone can go first. You can popcorn now.
I think I'm gonna go ahead because I do think that it's important to bring forth the work that that I'm doing with women and women within its complexity, who are advocating for the decriminalization of sex work, and also who identify as sex workers. So these are cis women, trans women, and queer women, who really, and in this conversation around labor, this is quite fitting in terms of this conversation about, the real struggles of unemployment, homelessness, food insecurity, and poor physical and mental health outcomes with very limited access to healthcare services. But also, the reality of the exposure to violence for women. And so, a lot of the women that we work with, and the sex workers that we work with, is really trying to negotiate their survival and using their agency to navigate their survival outside of the formal services, so they don't form part of the social grants, because sex work is criminalized and it's not recognized as a legitimate form of employment. So immediately they are, structurally excluded from social services and state institutions, and that continue to be unresponsive to their legitimate and complex needs. So sex workers have obviously increased risk for HIV and STIs based on their occupation. And so we Tekano supported a project, and obviously, it's about 6 years of working within this particular area of work, really advocating legal reform, and trying to really understand how the criminalization of sex work continued to further dispossess and contribute to the violence experienced by these women and compromising their safety in their work. And also the same ways in which, they are women who are mothers, who are putting food on the table for their children and families. And so the current law, stipulates that if you are implicated in sex workers' money, all of you are, should be criminalized, should be imprisoned. So we can understand how this layers of structural exclusion erasure of this form of work that many of the women, particularly in urban spaces, depend on, is completely kind of and it's all, you know, patriarchy, the question of bodies, what's respectable work. It all links to that conversation. But I think what's so important is that in the COVID-19 pandemic, here in Cape Town, you know, you could see the systematic exclusion from any workers' relief stimulus by the government. But also this mopping up of homeless people through the Strandfontein initiative, which was camps that were set up in Strandfontein to basically take all homeless people, sex workers, people living on the street, to this campsite with very inhumane conditions, right? And so, you know, the strategy was actioned by the city of Cape Town, setting up temporary homeless shelters. And what was really important is that we saw overcrowding, high concentration of people intensive, adequate food provision, and health and social services. And a lot of many of the sex workers and the LGBTIQ plus persons, which were part of of these camps, were exposed to high risk of spread of coronavirus, and many of them also, you know, are immunocompromised, and also, you know, experienced sexual violence and other forms of harassment. So, you know, what was very important about this particular project is the ways in which, you know, sex workers who were then peers did the care work, because many sex workers lost their livelihood and their forms of income during the COVID pandemic because of the fear of their clients and having to negotiate, go underground, meaning that they have to take up very unsafe conditions to be able to even get like, you know, 50 Rand just for the work, and then having to be content with really gruesome conditions of being treated and accepting low payment for their work. So I think in the conversations of labor, it is important to understand this political economy, and you know, the argument around the decriminalization is that sex work is a legitimate form of labor and employment for many women in urban spaces, and that's so important for these women to negotiate their survival and the survival of their families and their children. And so this, you know, this work becomes important to amplify, and that's why I'm bringing it into the space. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Florence, for sharing. Star, I'm not sure if there's something you would love to share when it comes to women, the oppression that they experience, social issues when it comes to the health equity argument, or if you'd like me to go straight to the comments and then we can just interact with those. It's up to you.
Maybe let's interact with the comments.
Okay.
Let's see what other people are saying.
The chat has been ablaze, and I do apologize for only getting to it now. I am by no means trying to erase you. Tlamelo Mutudi spoke about the effects of mining on the health of the community was outlined. Healthcare services offered to mining communities is another element that is supposed to be covered in the SLPs. And she goes on to say, women are part of communities affected by mining and its activities. Considering MPRDA and its regulations and NEMA, how is it that the community is so heavily impacted without intervention from companies? I think this is such an important question. I think, I'm not sure who I was talking to about this, because even in the context of rural areas as well, I'm not trying to steal your question, Tlamelo, but I would love to bring more context. I think in rural areas, Star, you're the one that mentioned that right now almost everything is digital. We are starting to use more and more tools, and I think we're moving towards the fourth industrial revolution. So a lot of solutions you'll find that they are digital, and you've got rural areas that are still being so left out because there's no signal in rural areas. Yet we've got big network or communication giants that are making billions or making a lot of money from our society, and yet they're not held accountable, or they aren't seen to. How can we make sure that they have a responsibility to make sure that even people in rural areas, even if they're not getting profit from that, but the responsibility of making sure that those people are not left behind? Because you've got solutions like Soul City app, where if people are feeling unsafe, they can just drop the pin of where they are. But if I'm in a rural area and I don't even have access to signal, I'm already left out of that. Even hospitals, if there's constantly no signal, how are people going to be documented when they're taking their bloods? How do we even start to make sure that, communities, how do we make sure that there's an intervention from companies, even in this context that Otlalemo is talking about, where we can see that the mining and its activities is affecting such communities? Without intervention from companies, how do we try and make sure that there is intervention?
Well, we must remember that it is not in the interest of mining companies to take care of community. It has never been. Historically, now it's the right thing to say because it's no longer apartheid, it's no longer the colonial era. We have a democracy now, and the constitution has explicit demands. But that people's rights need to be respected, and mining companies have to get licenses and have to go through certain processes. But the nature of mining itself, it's just because they have to blast. If you are mining coal, it's open cast. Whether you like it or not, if you are mining coal, it's going to be open cast. People who live around there will be affected, right? Whether the policy says then people need to be taken care of in this particular way, people would get sick because we are blasting. So it's a ongoing story. I mean, mining companies, in reality, it's not in their interest. Their interest is to make money, right? And so, I mean, I've worked with a number of mining areas in the rural KZN, Tobatuba and Melmoth, where communities were fighting that, but who even gave this mining company permission to even come and mine here? The law says people need to be consulted, and the consultation has to happen in a particular way, but in practice it doesn't happen. People just wake up and see trucks. Only one person is signed, either it's a chief or a headman, and they work hand in hand with politicians. I mean, we know how these things work. The social labor plans, yes, they have to abide by those, but in practice it doesn't happen. What usually happens is the man will build a community hall or a road because they need the road themselves, not necessarily because they're so caring to the community. They need the road themselves to transport to whatever they're going to be mining. So the first thing they will invest in is the road, and that is painted as, wow, these mining companies are doing fantastic work in communities. But actually, if you look at it, they need the road because they need to transport the coal. But families are left in worse off conditions. Worse off. I haven't read any research report where a mining company has actually done wonders. I always read devastating stuff, and when I go there, that's all I see. Animals are dying. There's no more water. Water is contaminated. People can't irrigate their crops anymore, and then people are sick because it's the same old story. And I don't know. I don't think the government knows this. It's not like these things are not known. That's another thing. The government knows this what the mining companies need to do, but they're not being held accountable. because it's the department that signs off mining rights, that signs off what you call this process when they're still exploring. I forgot what it's called when they're still exploring. The Department of Minerals and Energy signs off all those documents to give the mining. But people are always very unhappy. They say they never consulted. And those who are fighting, what we've seen in recent years, those who are fighting, they are being targeted. They are being killed. The activist was killed in Olobeni, how many years ago? 2016. Last year, Mam Fezega was shot in front of her house because she's been fighting. So that is what you see now. When those who are fighting, then their lives are in danger, and we don't know who is paying the killers. We don't know to what extent are the minings themselves involved in paying money to the hitmen who then go and shoot, because they are paid. We know they are paid, but who's paying them? You know. So it's just very devastating, and some people would argue, oh, but then we do need the minerals. So what then? I don't know. Do we? Can we think of another sort of kind of economy that is outside of mining? And why is this mining happening in particular areas where there's Black people who then need to be displaced, and it's Black women who then have to carry the costs? So I mean, I don't have all the answers, but all I know is I haven't read anything that says mining has done very well for the communities. I just see destruction all the way.
Yeah, Lance, would you like to briefly touch on this, or should I go on to more questions or comments?
I think you can go on to more questions or comments. I see we only have 20 minutes left.
So Mvuyo says, excellent program, Bongani, Lebo, and the whole team. Very significant that it takes place on International Human Rights Day and the day Madiba signed our constitution. Wow. I think it's important for us to recognize that. I had actually forgotten to mention that it is International Human Rights Day. I didn't realize that it also falls on the anniversary of the signing of the constitution. Tlalemo then says, thank you all. The exclusion of women from the sector is a deep embedded one and can be seen through the personal protective equipment and mining equipment designs and arguments around the inability of women to meet the inherent requirements of underground work. And I think she's talking about the issue of exclusion that you had also alluded to, that women were basically excluded, and it was in the legislation. So she says, yes, 100%. The issue of documentation is a long-standing one. It was once raised by the SAHRC and SCOs in the country, calling for the amendments of the Death and Birth Registration Act. So I think she's moving along to the lines of what we spoke about when it comes to legislation, that perhaps there has to be some form of reform or amendments in certain acts in trying to actually address issues. I don't know if Lance, you'd like to speak on this?
Not to the point directly, but I do think that it's important for us to reflect on questions around citizenship and registration. I think that this notion of documentation, and especially in relation to migrant workers, I think this is a very big issue in our country, because these are the kinds of ways in which neo-slavery takes place, and the exploitation of and how these companies get away with the gruesome and inhumane conditions of work that continue within the sector. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks. And then Bongani Maseko says, I agree with Star with the issue of individualizing a problem. We see how the big plastic industry has placed the burden on everyday people to recycle. Meanwhile, it is the big companies, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to mention, but he did make an example, it's in the chat, that are the ones that are adding to the problem. That company sells plastic bottles, not water. Yet we must make sure that we put our trash in the right boxes and use non-plastic straws. What do you think of this contradiction that we see from big companies where they sell us this narrative that we think they're actually selling water, but they are selling plastic bottles, and the burden is placed on us to try and rectify the problem. Meanwhile, they're profiting from the issue and contributing to the issue. Star.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I agree with Bongani. These are contradictions of capitalism. That's exactly how it works. It creates the problem and then creates the solution to its own problem. But the solution has to give profit. There's no other way. But in the process, it also destroys the very same basis for its operation. So if people are now in the streets and we have this crisis of social reproduction, it's because capital needs people, but the same people are being kicked out by capital itself. So those are the contradictions of the economic system that we have. We have a pandemic, but we know that a lot of people are already profiting from the pandemic, right? Because you need to make masks, and then the same mask people that say, oh, but you're throwing these masks in the ocean, they are now causing an environmental crisis, and then somebody has to now find a way of how then do we clean that. But even the way that we're going to clean that is going to create more problems, but more profits at the same time. So that's how it is. And I don't know if, I mean, the thing is, because capitalism has existed for so long, it's very difficult also to think outside of it. But the situation that we are in now calls for us to really think, to try and think outside of it. It's not like we have an option now of a luxury. The inequality is just it's unbearable now. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that is so true. And then Tlamelo goes on to say, I agree with Star. It is so important to continue documenting the experiences of women and commenting on legislation and policy that continues to exclude, discriminate against, and fails to protect women. And then she says, thank you all for this thought-provoking discussion. Well done to Tekano team on the series of ReaBua dialogues, and a fantastic end to the year. I think you did already talk to that, Star, like the importance of that. She's basically just agreeing with you. And then Lungi, I also believe, Anele, you have a story to highlight in connection to the undocumented women's stories as per your documentary. I did mention that, and the documentary will be coming out. Klanga says the status quo persists because of collusion between government and mining companies. In some communities, the mining company CSI budget is spent on municipal projects, especially infrastructure. And someone says, I agree with you, Klanga, let alone kickbacks paid by these multinationals. That's the gaming diagla. I'm not sure if Lance or Star, you'd like to bring your thoughts on this?
No, I agree. No, I agree with the comments. It's exactly what we've been saying, that the companies just want to make money, and they don't just come here. Somebody needs to allow them, and it's our government. And unfortunately, the people's views, the people who are affected directly, are often sidelined. When a company builds a community hall, often when you speak to people in the area, they say, we don't even use that hall. So but the hall is there to tick the box. It's not actually what makes sense here. What makes sense here, we need income generating programs, and people will give you examples of possible things that they would like to do. But I mean, those things don't happen, like I said, because the primary objective of a mining company is to make profit. and that's it. That's why they're here. That's why they are here, is to mine and make money out of it, as much money as possible. And if they can cut the costs and pay little compensation, that's what they're going to go for, because ultimately it's about how much revenue they generate at the end of the day.
Yeah. Lance, anything? Last words?
Yeah, just to say that it was an incredible conversation. I think it's very important, and I completely agree with Stan, all the comments. I think it's very important for us to also just continue to name, these kind of wicked problems, I suppose, that are all structural, and to also be able to organize. How do we collectively organize to disrupt and dismantle and hold these corporations accountable. Yeah. Thanks, Anela.
Thank you, Lance. Absolutely. I think you guys have mentioned everything, just in making sure that we control our own narrative, making sure that we do have archives, making sure that we are documented, making sure that we dismantle and start disrupting, the systems, and making sure that no generation starts from scratch, but we actually have a continuous movement that will eventually cause a shift. So yeah, I'd like to end with a quote, which I do think is quite widely used. It says, "If a pen is mightier than the sword, then the eraser is the most powerful tool of them all." And I think it's what we are seeing, because we are only just making a speck on even trying to resist erasure, or trying to take back what has been stolen in the form of narratives and in our society, in our history. South Africa, I'd like to thank Tekano for this fantastic and powerful opportunity to be part of the resistance against the erasure of women in South Africa. And thanks to Mail and Guardian for even allowing us to show it on the platform as a live critical dialogue, because I think that is just so necessary nowadays. And like I said earlier, this is the final day of the Watch Party series that was shown by Tekano, where filmmakers, films were commissioned for young Black women to make films where they're showing issues that Black people or Black women do struggle with, as a form of trying to resist the erasure that we do see happening. Thank you everyone for joining. It is now 10 to 2. I think we have exhausted all the points. I will allow you, Star and Lance, if there's anything that you feel like is really burning and you'd love to say. Other than that, I think we are done.
I just want to say thank you. Thanks for a great conversation. Thanks, Anel, for superb facilitation, and to Mail and Guardian. And well done to Tekano for the initiative. Thanks.
Thank you. Lance.
Echoing the thank yous and the gratitude, Star, thank you for your insight and yeah, your beautiful ability to be able to concretize a lot of the really challenging issues, and Anele, obviously, for your compassion in the way you facilitate. Yeah, it was a fantastic conversation. And importantly, thank you to Tekano and for Lesedi, Crystal, Severa, and the Tekano staff for running this ReaBua and for the importance of it, in this moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, guys. I'm signing out.
Great.